All right, so let's dive into the rule book here. First thing listed here in the suspension category for our class rules are the A-arm or wishbone suspension penalty. So that's a 0.7 penalty that a lot of cars have to take, regardless whether it's necessarily a double wishbone or just a suspension like a multi-link that's utilizing an A-arm design. So the S2000 being front and rear double wishbone will have to take that penalty. A car like a BRZ, which is McPherson strut in the front but multi-link in the rear still utilizes an A-arm, so that is going to be a penalty as well. The BMW M3, however, does not have to take this penalty, and per the guy who makes the rules, the cornering speeds are that much different that they thought they had to put this penalty in place to try to equalize the cars. At least looking at the results that I've been seeing regionally as well as nationally, the penalty's working because the times between the M3s and the S2000s, which are the cars that are at the pointy end of the podium there, are finishing extremely close. We're talking tenths and hundreds of seconds apart. If you were to get rid of that 0.7 penalty right now, I think that would be a lot different. So for the sake of keeping the competition close as possible, that penalty is in there at the moment. So a couple other things. It's a 0.5 penalty to replace, modify, remove control arms, camber arms, links, or toe arms. So in an S2000, where you would normally do that is on an AP1 car, and you've been doing too much reading on the internet and getting a lot of bad advice because there's a ton of it out there. You're going to check out those rear toe arms on the car to think it's going to make any significant difference in your quote-unquote snap oversteery AP1. And that's a 0.5 hit. I don't recommend taking that. Moving along, add, modify Watts link, a panhard bar, or a torque arm. Strictly not applicable. That's more for domestic cars that have a solid rear axle. Moving further than that, non-OEM shocks or struts with external reservoirs or shaft diameters greater than 40 millimeters. So with the external reservoirs, that's something that a lot of sanctioning bodies penalize. It gives you a good increase in performance, also increases the price of those shocks considerably. So they make you take a hit on that, and that hit is substantial in this class. It's a 0.7 hit, equal to the A-arm hit. It's simply not worth taking that hit. And that penalty is so severe, it actually, through a series of steps, is the reason why I ended up going with the MCS suspension on here. The next thing that you have to take a penalty for, another 0.4, in this case a 0.7 penalty, is an increase of track width of 4 inches or greater. It's just not necessary to do in these cars, so we'll skip over that. The one that may impact drivers driving the S2000s is this non-OEM metallic spherical design, as well as the modified control arms. So if you take an adjustable ball joint and put that on your control arm to get an additional couple degrees of camber on the front, then you're gonna have to take that 0.2 hit. So last year I was running a car with those adjustable ball joints on the bottom, and it was a 0.2 hit. Now, if you're taking that 0.2 hit, you might as well take the hit for everything else in this category. And one of the things in this category are non-OEM metallic or spherical design replacement bushings. So I replaced all the rubber bushings in the car with metal, and it took forever. It was a major winter project, taking all the control arms off, taking all the rubber bushings out, pressing in all the steel ones, and then repainting all the control arms, putting everything back together. It sucked. So this, maybe 2 weeks ago or so, I drove an AP1 that had stock bushings. I could barely tell the difference. It's something that's gonna give you a little bit better feel. Does it necessarily translate into better lap times? I personally don't think so, so I don't think that penalty is worth taking. So that's just a quick 101 on the rules. You can read about all of this stuff. It's available on NASAProRacing.com, and highly suggest you take a deep dive into this rule book prior to starting your build. So in the next part, let's talk about the actual suspension setup itself. So let me get these things unboxed and we'll start. All right, let's talk about the suspension, right? This is an extremely important topic when you're discussing about how to make your car a race car. Suspensions specific for the S2000, the range goes anywhere from, let's call it on the low end for just lowering coilovers, anywhere from $800 to the high end of $10,000 plus for custom penalties, right? So there's a whole gamut out there, right? So the hard part is figuring out what you need to win and what the capabilities that you're looking to get out of the suspension are. So one of the most popular suspensions out there for the car that everybody's always talking about is Öhlins. Now, Öhlins is a great company. They offer a product, the Öhlins DFE coilover, that starts at about $2,000. So it's very entry level and affordable for most guys. It's a very compliant setup on street. It's a good suspension for a multi-purpose car, a car that's driven on street and then track as well. Budget friendly. I got nothing but good things to say about that product specifically. It's actually a really high quality component. The thing is that once you're trying to make that suspension a race setup and you need to add some springs to it, or you need to get it revalved, the costs start really creeping up at a pretty rapid rate. So you're going to be looking at between $3,000 to $3,500 to get that $2,000 initial purchase set up to the point that you want it at, plus time of taking it out, taking it back in, or you can even be buying it, but who knows. Whatever the case is, to have a properly set up, almost DFV setup is going to cost between $3,000 and $3,500. That's just how it is. And at the end of the day, you're really limited because it's a single adjustable shock. Now, don't get me wrong. There's some guys on that suspension that are brutally fast, right? So it works, and it's a great suspension. But for me, I went with the MCS. So motion control systems, there's not a lot of guys running this on this S2000 chassis. There are a lot of BMW drivers driving it and various other chassis. It's just a great product. So MCS is a American-based company based at Road Atlanta. So the guys are just great there. You pick up the phone, you call them, you ask them, why should I buy your suspension? Help me set this up. What settings do you recommend? There's always somebody there. They're always going to answer. So for me, on a personal level, to have an American company made by American workers that's supported by Americans, that's a big sell, right? So one of the main reasons I go with MCS. Now, this is the same exact suspension setup essentially that I ran last year. And one of the other things is that this is one of the few shocks out there that are a double adjustable S2000 shock without an external reservoir. There's a number of shocks out there that have an external canister bolted on the side or routed somewhere else. And that's a pretty major penalty, as we discussed for the rules earlier. So this is a double adjustable shock with internal bodies on it. So there's no external canister, nothing. This is what you get. So what you get when you buy MCS is a shock absorber, a collar, a perch, and then the top hat piece, right? And that's it. Everything else you need to source yourself. Now, there's a lot of vendors out there that'll help you get set up with that, but when I say source yourself, essentially you need to buy springs independently, a helper spring, you need to buy the spring coupler, and top hats. It's just how it is, right? A lot of race components are that way. When you buy something like an Olin's, it comes all assembled. It has all the parts that you need ready to go. But when you get into like more race grade components like this, you're going to be doing a little bit of the legwork yourself. So let's talk about the shock setup itself. It is a full threaded collar all the way down the body, right? The adjustability is on the top. So once I have this installed in the car right now, I don't feel like messing with it. So I'm just kind of leaving it in this phase. There's a little knob on the top. You push it down for rebound. You let it pop up for compression. You have full adjustability there, and it is nice. It's a really nice piece. The other factor of choosing MCS over the one other competitor that I found, JRZ, that offers a non-external body double adjustable shock, is the fact that they offer NASA racers contingency. So these guys are paying $250 every race weekend for first place and $750 for nationals. That's a huge deal. So I was running their shock last year. I got $750 credit for winning nationals towards another set of suspensions with those. That's huge, right? The sport is already expensive enough. So it's great having a company that supports racers with contingency. And I like to support them back by continuing to buy their product. So let's get into some of the specifics on the parts that I'm using here. So these are all the components that are going to make this MCS dampener a coilover, right? So here's a quick detailed look at the actual dampener itself. Like I said, it's a threaded body all the way down. One of the things that you don't see here is a bump stop. So they don't utilize any external bump stop. This thing is set up in a fashion that won't allow it to destroy itself if you bottom out. I had 2 or 3 pretty bad offs. I sent the videos to the guys at MCS. I'm asking them, hey, you think I should be rebuilding their shocks? They're like, yeah, you'll be fine. So the service life on these is about 3 years for race use, which is huge. It's phenomenal, actually. Moving on to some of the other parts, right? So the springs. I've had nothing but good luck with Hyperco springs. I hear great things about Swifts also. I've never used them, but what I'm using here on this car is going to be a 750-pound front spring rate and a 700-pound rear spring rate. Last year, I ran 50 pounds less than that. So that was a 700 front and a 650 rear. I'm just gonna step it up slightly just for the sake of education to see how well that works. The goal for me is always to run a decent amount of ride height because there's a limited amount of suspension travel on these cars, and run the lightest spring rate that I possibly can because I like a compliant suspension. I like to be able to utilize curbs and take some bumps and do everything like that. If you spend a little too much time on the internet, the advice you'll get is to go super stiff. And for me, it just hasn't worked. I like a compliant suspension. So here's the mainspring. This is a 7-inch long, 2.25 inner diameter hyper-Perco spring. And I went this route based on the recommendation from Carceps of running this because it's a very commonly used spring diameter and you can find tons of them. So if I decide I want to go down in spring rate or up in spring rate, very easy. There's a ton of used springs out there. I go that route. Fairly priced, about 70 bucks a pop. Next thing here, we have the helper spring, right? And that just takes up some of the slack because this doesn't cover the whole entire spring length. So it basically holds this thing down and it works that way. So between there, more parts from Carceps, goodies from those guys. So this is a Carceps spring coupler. It sits right between the springs. So once it's all mounted up, I'll have some pictures. And then on the top, I decided to go with Carceps again, Brian Carwin. Awesome dude, great racer, multi-time SCCA national champion, and a great engineer overall. So MCS offers top hats as well. They're about 800 bucks for the car, and Carceps makes them for about 440 for a set. So I went with that route. So adjustable collar will sit here. This top spring hat thing will sit underneath here. And the top hats I went with are a spherical design, which is really sweet. So this will give it a little bit of movement room over there, and it's not gonna bind up the coil or anything like that. So that is the suspension. Super excited to get this on. Even though it's basically exactly what I ran last season with a little bit stiffer spring rate, it's just awesome getting new products like this and bolt them onto the car. All right, so let's get into the suspension setup here. The actual assembled coilover. This is just a roughly assembled mock coilover that I just did. I'm not ready to bolt all this stuff together. I have an event coming up at Summit Point Raceway here in 2 weeks where I'll be co-driving basically a replica S2000, so the last one that I drove, which was an APT. This one's particularly an AP1 is built almost exactly like mine, except the only main difference, besides being an AP1 versus an AP2, is that it's running a set of AST 5100 coilovers, which is the coilover I used to run, so I'm pretty familiar with that setup. So here's the MCS roughly assembled, and we'll start with this. Let's go into the stuff that people are probably interested in, is the pricing on this equipment. And we'll start with the top hats. So Carceps makes a set of spherical top hats, really high quality product. I used the same setup on the last car, worked great. And these are about $440 retail pricing. MCS also makes a top hat setup for the S2000, it's about $800. So these are a pretty good buy at almost half the cost. The top Spring Perch, this piece, is included with the MCS setup. And then we have the HyperCo helper spring, right? These springs are super lightweight, and they go for about $150 for a set of 4. Then we have the spring coupler provided by Carceps as well. Very basic piece, just goes between the 2 springs, and these go for about 30 bucks. I think they're plastic. They just kind of hold the 2 springs, the main spring and the helper spring together. And then we have the HyperCo 7-inch long, 2.25 inner diameter. And this one is the 750-pound spring. And these HyperCo springs go for about $300 retail. And then finally, we have the shock absorber itself with the lower perch, which is included. And the shocks retail for about $33.50. So that brings us to a grand total of $4,270 for the set. So it's not the cheapest coilover setup out there, and it's far from the most expensive setup. As I mentioned, you can do a really nice setup with the Olins DFVs for about roughly $3,000 to $3,500 bucks. But at the end of the day, here's the issue. It's a single adjustable suspension. And the knob on top of that suspension adjusts compression and rebound together, which I just don't understand for a race setup. Again, there's guys that are really, really fast on that setup. It does work. However, at some point in your racing career, you're going to get to a point where you're going to say, hey, I would like to adjust my rebound and the compression independently. And next thing you know, you're going to be selling that setup at a loss and then buying a better setup. So I'm really big on just buying the right equipment right off the bat. And in my opinion, without spending an excessive amount of money, racing-wise, this is the way to go. The other company that is offering a product similar to this right now for the S2000 is JRZ. And the JRZ setup, two things. One, not American-made like these are. That's a big sell for me. And that's a personal thing, so take it for what that's worth. But they're also not offering contingency for NASA drivers. So that's a huge thing to have one American-made company that's supporting NASA drivers with contingency every event. And that contingency could be used for new products. It could be used for rebuilds or whatever you want. So that's a big help. Owens is also, by the way, offering contingency. But I don't want to be in a situation where I'll be buying a shock that has limited adjustability, and then also I'll be selling to buy something that I want later on down the line. I'd rather just spend a few extra bucks right now and get the best product that I possibly can. And I think right now, for this class specifically, not having the external cans and then having dual adjustability independent of each other, that this is the best you're going to do. So that's why I went with this. I don't see a lot of guys running it just yet. Perhaps it's because the a la carte setup that you have to do on it, or the lack of familiarity in the community really, or possibly just the cost. The S2000 now, it started out somewhere as around a $35,000 car, and now you can get cheap ones for $8,000. So this suspension would roughly cost half the cost of a car, to nicer, clean examples for $20,000 to $25,000. And then, the creme de la creme CR low mile cars seems like they're selling for $60,000 or $70,000 at this point. But anyway, if you have, a cheaper S2000, this is a major investment, and I get that. And I can see why the Owens is popular at that price range. But if your goal is ultimately to race the car, to make it a race car, to win races, and be extremely competitive, unfortunately, you got to spend the money. And at a reasonable budget, I think this is by far the best you're going to get. And hopefully, maybe somebody can send me a message and show me something better. But MCS worked for me. I won a national championship with this. I got multiple track records with the suspension. So I'm sticking with them, and it works. All right, and that should be about it as far as suspension. I'm looking forward to getting these things bolted up. It's going to be probably sometime around January or so. I'm in no rush. The car's just hanging out. We don't even have our first test day until at least March here in Northern Virginia. So as I get a little bit of time here and there, I'll just be wrenching around the car, making some videos, giving you guys information. So look forward to making the next one, and I'll see you guys soon.